Hello, friends, and welcome to LLBN Creation Sabbath, a special 5-part series dedicated to celebrating Creation Sabbath. I'm Briana Nealey, and I'm joined here today by two experts, my co-host, Dr. Tim Standish, and a special guest that he brought along, Dr. John Kurlinski. Welcome.
Thanks so much for having us. We're excited to be here.
Yep.
Thank you for being here, yes. And so today we have a special program planned for you. We're going to be talking about how science and God relate to each other. And that's a very interesting concept. I know a lot of people in the world believe that God has no place in science, but I believe you two would beg to differ.
Well, I certainly would. The interesting thing is I'm a scientist. My training is as a biologist. I also have training in public policy. And so I'm interested in how governments and things like that work. And John and I have been talking. Hey, we've got a shared interest there. There's a point of connection.
Yes, I have an interest in actually biblical studies in the Bible and in God, but I also wanted to know where things came from and why. And in a history background, I wanted to know, well, what does the real story say? And how does that interface with what science is telling us? So our paths cross on these issues of creation and evolution and origins, and it's fun to be here.
That's right. And you know, one of the big mistakes that people make when they talk about science and faith is they have the illusion that somehow or other we're talking about completely different things. In fact, I believe a more correct view is that these things must go hand in hand. The question is not science versus faith, it is what kind of faith leads to what kind of science. And the Christian faith, the biblical Christian faith, I believe is very, very, very almost essential to doing good science, the kind of science that benefits mankind, lets us know about the present, and helps us to understand the past.
Absolutely, and I think, Tim, you had a verse that you wanted to share with us today?
It is Isaiah 40, verse 8, and I don't know, it'll be fun to read the whole chapter here because there are prophecies being made here about the Messiah. And then here in verse 8, Isaiah writes, "The grass withers, the flower fades, but the word of our God shall stand forever." And this is something that I've found in my own experience to be true. Yes, as a Christian, my faith is founded on what is contained in God's word. But it's not just sitting out there all alone. There is a beautiful correlation between the claims of Scripture, the record of history that is here in the Bible, and what we find when we go out and actually look at the world. We examine it using what we call our empirical senses. So that would be our senses of touch, our sight, taste, sound, those sorts of things. Those things where we take in information.
The God of the universe invites you to, and he says, taste and see the Lord is good. He tells, test me, empirically prove that I am faithful. He invites us to do the very thing and exercise belief in him, exercise belief in his word. It's what we're called to do if you're a biblical person.
Exactly. I mean, it's fascinating. We're not told, just believe, please believe, and then you'll be somehow or other more righteous. God says, test me, prove all things, go and look. And then the Bible makes these claims like the heavens declare the glory of God. Well, it doesn't say just believe that the heavens declare the glory of God. That's an invitation. Go out, look up, be amazed.
See, we're all searching for things that we can't actually, there are some things we can't empirically find out about ourselves, and that, I believe, is why God chose to, one of the reasons why he chose to reveal himself in his word. We can get insight into greater realities in ourselves that we would totally be clueless about had he not told us. So now we get to go check out and see if what he said was so. And it's fun to do these sorts of things, engaging out in the, whether it be in the Grand Canyon or whether it be in the deserts of the Middle East, wherever.
Exactly, and that's why I'm excited about this particular program that we're going to look at, this particular short film that I played a role in producing, because it is about one of the scientists, I count archaeologists as scientists, one of those scientists who's gone out there and actually looked at the evidence in the Middle East and examined some of these questions that people raise about the accuracy of the Bible. It's interesting to me. Here we have this, if nothing else, even if you do not believe this is the inspired word of God, which I do, even if you don't believe that, the Bible is an incredible ancient document that gives us insights into the world back in the past.
All right.
And it's incredible to me that there are people living today who think they know better what happened 1,000 or 2,000 years ago or 3,000 years ago, or as this particular film that we're going to see talks about, more than 3,000 years ago. They think they know better than the people who were there at the time.
Yes.
I really appreciate this film too, because on this film is featuring the chair of my personal doctoral dissertation. He is an amazing person, Randy Yonker. You'll get to meet him in the film shortly. And just the experience I had of coming to this question of where I came from and what's the Bible all about and what's the historicity. I was a history major before all these things. And he was able to point me to the resources, point me in the directions of finding a rich vein, showing how good the Word of God is when it comes to his historical facts. And I just really treasure the man and his guidance in my own personal development.
And that's one of the fantastic things for me about the Christian faith. The Christian faith is actually about empirical reality. As a scientist, that's one reason why I love Christianity. Well, of course, obviously, we're all engaged in a quest for truth. But if the Bible is not giving us an accurate picture of events that have actually occurred, then I'm not sure I would be so excited about it.
Now you said empirical reality.
Yes.
Would you explain that term a little bit for us?
Empirical reality is the reality that we take in through our senses. So I mentioned the empirical senses.
Yes,
the five senses,
yes.
right. And, you know, if somebody says, well, you know, I believe that there are little pink fairies that live in Ireland and they do various little pink fairy things, but nobody can detect those things. Well, that's all fine and good, but Christianity is not that kind of faith. Christianity is about real events that really did occur in the world. People observed them.
Yeah, and the issue really rubs at this point is because if you can't trust it in its historicity or in the historical record of what it said, you have a harder time having faith for the things that are beyond empiricism to prove, whether it be miracles, whether it be our own existence itself is founded on the idea that God exists and is the creator of it all, and that's why we're doing it Creation Week.
There we go.
There we go.
Absolutely. Well, I think it's time for us to actually go ahead and watch that video we were talking about earlier, and it's featuring Dr. Randy Yonker.
3,000 years ago, the prophet Moses walked up this mountain, Mount Nebo in modern-day Jordan, and I imagine him sitting down and looking across the Dead Sea and the Jordan Valley at the promised land on the other side. Moses is one of the most interesting characters in the history of the world. He wrote about his family, he wrote about his tribe, he wrote about the history of his people. In fact, he wrote about the history of the world as he knew it. The modern science of archaeology can tell us all kinds of things about the events that Moses wrote about. But sometimes it challenges our understanding. We're going to look at the science of archaeology with Dr. Randy Yonker of Andrews University. We're going to examine some of those things about archaeology that challenge our understanding of what Moses wrote. And then we're going to look at ways in which archaeology can in fact inform our understanding of his writings.
So we're cruising along the edge of biblical Moabite land. The Moabites lived here, we think, according to the Bible, they were here during the time of the Exodus when the Israelites came up from Egypt. They were forced to actually travel up the same highway heading north, the desert highway, because the Edomites to the south around Petra, the Moabites right in this area, and of course the Ammonites, they did not want the Israelites marching through their land over here to the west, so the Israelites had to go around their kingdoms and come out here to the edge of the desert highway. A lot of ancient copper mines, that was very important also in biblical times. A lot of mining, not only does it go on today, but it went on in antiquity as well. And of course, my belief is at times camels were probably used to transport some of those ores, but that's what we're exploring, what some of the debate is about exactly when were camels used extensively in this part of the world. When I went into archaeology, my first excavation was in Israel. And then around 1992, they asked me to excavate Tel Jalul, which is just to the east of the biblical town of Madaba. And we've been working there now for over 23 years. There's a large tell you can see up to the north here. That's the highest part, not only of this immediate area, but for miles or kilometers around. Everyone can see Jalul. We believe that it was probably ancient biblical Bezer, B-E-Z-E-R, mentioned in the book of Judges, as one of the Levitical cities. A tell itself is actually just a sequence of what we call occupational levels, sort of like a cake. It's got a series of buried villages or cities, one on top of the other, and over the centuries it builds up to quite a good height. So what we do is come to the site, we start at the top and sort of excavate the cake backwards. The most recent stuff is at the top of the tell. The deeper we dig, the older the remains are. This is where the ancient water system from the Iron Age was located. So we've been excavating the edge of it. The water system is actually full of water right now because of the recent rains, the winter rains here in Jordan. But underneath this water, and you can see over in that area there's a plastered reservoir that contained the water, or kept the water for the ancient people. So we're exploring that right now. In this field, the earliest building we found turned out to date, according to the pottery, to the 13th, 12th century BC. That'd be about the time the Israelites were settling in the land of Reuben after their initial conquest of the area. And we found a typical 4-room Israelite house. After the Israelites were kicked out by the Moabites, who probably lived here for a short period of time, the Ammonites took over. And we know that because we found pottery, figurines, and even some inscriptions that definitely have Ammonite writing on them. In the floor of the Ammonite period house, there's a large cave down there. And in that cave we found over 20 bodies. Maybe they were Ammonites that were killed in some kind of a warfare. There were women, there were children, not too many adult men. Maybe there was a disease. But anyway, they threw all the bodies in there unceremoniously, and then the hole was covered up until we excavated it. One summer, I had finished my master's degree in biology, and I was in Sacramento. I wasn't taking teacher education classes. I actually had a strange summer with nothing to do. And I discovered that they were teaching at the local university, California State University, Sacramento campus. They were teaching a couple of courses in archaeology, and I thought, why don't I do something for fun, while I'm deciding what to do with my graduate training for the future. And I decided to sign up for these 2 classes. One was called Biblical Archaeology, and the second one was Egyptology. And I thought those would both be interesting as well as beneficial for understanding, the archaeological background for the biblical story. I was surprised they would actually teach a course called Biblical Archaeology at the State University, because typically, the secular world is a bit more skeptical. At California State University, Sacramento, I signed up for these 2 courses, and it was in the first course. They were meeting different days of the week during the summer session, and the first course, I think it met twice a week, as I remember, in the evening, and it was Biblical Archaeology, and the professor at that time, he was an anthropology professor, an archaeologist. He had experience in biblical archaeology, but he had been trained in the typical historical critical methodology, and he had grave doubts about the historicity of a lot of the Bible. And I remember on the very first evening, he gave several examples of why we as scholars, young scholars, had to be careful not to take the Bible too seriously or not take its statements as historical. Was the presence of anachronisms in the early biblical stories, things that are out of time. An anachronism would be like saying George Washington drove in an automobile, which we know there weren't cars in George Washington's time. So the idea that there were domesticated camels in the time of Abraham was an example of one of these anachronisms. Professor Goldfried pointed out that according to archaeological research, camels were not domesticated until about 1200 or 1000 BC, 1,000 years before the time of Christ. And of course, according to traditional biblical chronology, Abraham would have lived several centuries before that time. Some people would date Abraham to maybe 1,800 years before the time of Christ. Others push him back as early as 2,000 or even 2,200 years before the time of Christ. So you're talking about Abraham having camels like 1,000, 1,200 years before camels are said to have been domesticated. And so Dr. Goldfried said that shows you why the Bible's statements can't be trusted historically. There's too many anachronisms like this. Clearly the story was written much later. Many of the details about Abraham, such as his having camels, were made up. They were kind of inserted into the story at a much later time. So when you think of Abraham, forget about the camels. And I remember that made an impression on me. It was a problem I never even thought of, because when anyone thinks about the Middle East, we all think of deserts and camels, and that's sort of a common assumption we have. It never occurred to me that the biblical statements on camels wouldn't be historically accurate. Just a little detail, of course, but it always impressed me, and I remember sticking that in the back of my mind, wondering how good is the evidence for that? How important is this as an issue, and so forth. But I always wondered about those camels and how good was the scientific evidence for a late domestication. And from that time on, whenever I would see an article dealing with camels in the Middle East, I would kind of put it away. I would read it and file it. And in the back of my mind, I was really wondering, what is the true story about the history of domestication? And as the years went by, I discovered it's a lot more complicated than people lead you to believe. Scholars certainly have definite attitudes, but I discovered there are many scholars that argue for a much earlier date for the domestication. Some scholars will argue, and they're not necessarily interested in the biblical story, but they'll argue that domestication had to have occurred at least by 2000 BC. That's well before most biblical critics will say. And yet there are other scholars who will say, no, the domestication was actually later than 1000 BC. So I realized there was a wide diversity of opinion, even within the scholarly world, and many of the scholars were not at all motivated by or interested in the biblical questions. So that course, the questions that Dr. Goldfried raised about the camels, the questions are always kind of in the back of my mind, and I would collect the articles and look at them, but I never really saw a good final solution, a good answer to this. Opinions were all over the place. So that was one of those questions I sort of had to put on my intellectual mental shelf and wait to see if more information would come someday that would help settle the question for me a little bit more. And eventually that would lead to this discovery that happened many years later when we were in the desert of Egypt, north of the traditional Mount Sinai, when we made this discovery of a petroglyph that seemed to be sort of a linchpin in helping understand when were camels actually domesticated.
the ancient city of Petra thrived on the trade that camels allowed. Camel trains came through here with goods from all over the then known world. So we decided to come here and look at how camels worked in ancient societies.
We've just entered into one of the chambers of the famous obelisk tomb, which is near the entrance of the famous archaeological park of Petra. We went into this chamber in particular because there's a lot of petroglyphs that have been carved into the sides of this chamber's walls. For some reason in antiquity, people like to carve various animals, horses and camels and so forth. This particular chamber has quite a few camels actually. You can see how they've taken some kind of a tool and carved into the rock, leaving a light-colored amount of the rock visible. In this case, this was carved into kind of a black sooty area, and because this fire was probably lit in recent times to give heat for maybe Bedouin living in the cave, it created soot on the wall, and this was carved through that soot. So this particular camel drawing is probably a recent one, but it shows again how important camels are to the culture here in southern Jordan. We might have some slightly earlier ones over here. Again, this is a camel petroglyph. You can see the four legs down here, the long neck of the camel, the hump, and here's another one going the other direction. It doesn't look like these have any humans riding on them, so we wouldn't know that these were domesticated or not based on the context of the picture, but because we can date this from the patina and from some of the Arabic writing that's on the walls of this tomb, we know these are fairly recent. And that this would be a time when camels are definitely domesticated. But you'll see throughout Petra, this was a major hub, and camel caravans were extremely important for bringing goods all over the Middle East. A few years ago, there was a flash flood that washed out the bottom of the Seek. The actual floor of this canyon that goes into Petra was actually several meters above where I'm standing right now. But when the water washed all the mud away, they discovered the original pavement of the floor, and they also found on this wall to my right about a half a dozen large full-size camels that have been carved right into the rock. The legs are unfortunately broken, but you can see the feet. These are the back feet of the camel. The front feet of the camel, you can see the belly and his hump up there. There's another camel there and some more down that direction. And in front of the camel, leading the caravan, is a robed individual, a man, leading his camels on in. So this is a wonderful depiction of an actual camel caravan coming maybe somewhere from Saudi Arabia, maybe bringing incense in to be traded here at the Great Emporium at Petra. So I went to the University of Arizona and studied with Dr. William Deaver there, who was one of the preeminent Syro-Palestinian archaeologists at the time, and very much at the center of the biblical archaeology debate, whether there was really such a thing as biblical archaeology and what was the proper relationship between the Bible and the scientific facts that were coming out of the ground. And so it was a great privilege for me, and I learned a lot to go down to the University of Arizona and study with Dr. Deaver. And in a sense, he really helped launch my field career. And I really feel a sense of gratitude for how he trained me and the support that he gave me. The idea that camels were domesticated quite late can be traced back to William Foxwell Albright, a famous American biblical archaeologist. He wanted to show that the archaeological record somehow could be made compatible with the biblical story. He saw the story of Abraham coming from Mesopotamia, and he was wondering whether Abraham really would have had camels that early or not. As he read the ancient literature from Mesopotamia, he saw that there was a group of people known as the Amorites who actually traveled along the same route that the Bible says Abraham traveled along. Of course, the Bible indicates that Abraham had Amorite ancestry somehow. So Albright made this hypothesis that maybe Abraham was one of the Amorites that came across the Fertile Crescent into Palestine in one of these migrations. Since the ancient texts also indicated the Amorites had donkeys, Albright suggested that Abraham, rather than having camels, must have had donkeys. He was a donkey caravaneer, if you will. And because he was so wedded to that idea that Abraham was an Amorite with donkeys, Albright had to insist that Abraham's camels did not really exist. We're at a camel camp here in Wadi Rum, A lot of tourists today like to come down here and enjoy riding camels in the desert, but this is actually along the old route where the camel caravans during the Nabatean time, 200 years before the time of Christ, would come up from Yemen with the incense trade, come all the way up to Petra, a major node. The question is, how long have these caravans been running, these camel caravans? We're still in the Wadi Rum, but we've moved some distance now, and we're at the Anfashia inscriptions, and there's also a lot of petroglyphs on the face of this particular rock. And once again, we see that camels are prominently displayed. There's stylistic differences in these petroglyphs. Some of the camels are solid the way they're drawn, others are just sort of outlined. You can see there's a large variety of them. One thing that's unique about the petroglyphs is that you find inscriptions with the pictures, and those inscriptions actually help us date the artistic depictions of the camels. We can also see that there's a variation in the patina of some of the drawings and inscriptions. The darker patina, the more time there's been oxidizing where the rock was cut away, that typifies most of this petroglyph cliff here, but there are a few that are very light, and that would indicate they were carved much more recently. One of the most obvious, actually, is a very recent one at the top of this face here. It seems like it even says Barbara, a modern name. You can see that where the rock has been cut away, it's very, very light in color. In 1998, I was with a group of friends, scholars, even some family members, and we were visiting in the Sinai area near St. Catherine's Monastery, where the story of Moses receiving the Ten Commandments from God is commemorated. And I had heard that there were some early inscriptions to the north of St. Catherine's Monastery in the Wadi Nasid. These are actually Proto-Sinaitic inscriptions, the earliest form of the alphabet that probably was the precursor to the Hebrew alphabet that our Bible was written in. And I wanted to see these and wanted my students with me to see them. And we took off in our four-wheel drives, and sure enough, we found the Wadi Nasib, and we found the very mountain in one of the photographs upon which the Proto-Sinaitic inscriptions had been inscribed, probably at least 1500 BC. So we got out of our Jeeps, we hiked up to the mountain, to the rock where these inscriptions were supposed to be located, and sure enough, there they were. I noticed that to the left of the Proto-Sinaitic inscription was a 12th dynasty inscription from an Egyptian pharaoh, Menemes III. And so I knew that both of these inscriptions were quite old, and the patina on them indicated that they had been there for quite some time, at least 1500 BC, if not earlier. As I stepped back and started looking at the rest of the rock, and I saw something that had not appeared in the literature of earlier scholars who had visited these sites. There were petroglyphs on the rocks. And as I was looking at these petroglyphs, these picture drawings, if you will, carved into the rock, suddenly one jumped out at me. There was a camel carved into the rock. The patina indicated it was a very old petroglyph. That in itself was kind of interesting because it would indicate that that camel was drawn before 1500 BC based on the inscription. But then I saw in front of the camel and attached to the camel there was a human being. He was holding a rope and he was leading the camel, and it looked like somebody had tried to draw kind of an ancient camel caravan in the area. And that was kind of interesting because not far from these inscriptions there is a series of ancient Egyptian mines that date to the same time period. So it looked to me like someone was trying to show what it looked like for these camels to take the ore and carry it out of these mines, perhaps across the sand back to Egypt. And that made perfect sense to me, but it hit me, wow, if these are pictures of humans using camels as early as 1500 BC or even earlier, this contradicts Albright's idea that camels were not domesticated until 1200 BC. They clearly in Egypt, in this area not far from Palestine, were being used by humans at least 300 years before Albright's date, and maybe 400 or 500 years or more. We don't really know for sure. So this opened up a whole new way of thinking for me about the date of Abraham's camels. I was raised in a Christian family, but when I was young, my parents had some issues and they divorced when I was about 12 years of age. And up till that time, they'd been pretty faithful churchgoers, and that made an impact on me. My grandparents on both sides of the family were also Christians and made sure I went to church school and went to church and so forth. And I always appreciated their support and their insight and so forth. But when my parents split up, that kind of left a lot of questions for me. You know, suddenly church didn't seem so important. My parents at that time quit going to church. I was even told I didn't have to go to church. So from about the time 12, 13 on, I was pretty much on my own to make, decisions about whether I believed in God, whether I believed in Christ, whether I believed in the Bible, and so forth. But my grandparents kept encouraging me, and while I had a lot of questions, as I was going through high school and going through college, particularly in the area of evolution, a lot of my friends that I would hang out with went to the local high school, and they would tell me about the theory of evolution. And I was trying to make this all come together about what I was learning about the Bible on the one hand, and yet what science seemed to be telling me on the other hand. So this was a struggle I had all the way through my high school years. And when I went to college, I chose to go to a Christian college, Pacific Union College. My parents weren't particularly keen on the idea at the time. They didn't say no, but they weren't particularly excited about it. But I went anyway, and while I was there, I majored in 2 areas, not because I necessarily was interested in these areas for career choices, but because I was curious about whether God really existed or not. So I majored in theology, religion major technically, to explore the questions about God and what does the Bible really say about God and about Christianity. And I also majored in biology at the time because I was curious about what science had to say. And I had a lot of questions, and I was looking at the different ways science would approach reality and the way theologians would approach reality, and trying to make this all come together. So that was sort of my background, actually. I discovered that answers aren't always easy to come by, but I also discovered that science doesn't always have the answers neat and clean either. So I sort of resolved my own mind to give faith a chance. Archaeology gave me a chance to actually study some of the challenges against the Bible, look at the archaeological evidence and material and see, is the Bible completely out to lunch? Is it completely fictitious? Or are there archaeological discoveries that, I don't like to use the word prove the Bible, but are they compatible with the Bible? Is it totally unreasonable to think that there might be something to the Bible, that the Bible might have something of value, that it might even have something that's historically rooted and grounded? And my own conclusion has been, yes, there is reason to believe that the Bible writers knew what they were talking about, and there's enough there to hang your faith on, so to speak. Although to me, faith is still primarily a personal relationship with God. It's not something you get just from reasoning it out. But I do think that belief in God and belief in the biblical story can have a rational and a reasonable component.
Well, I've been fascinated by the science of archaeology. All of these amazing things from the past that tell us what has happened. I'm also fascinated by the Bible and the record of the past that it gives us. When those 2 things come together, it's truly magical. In the case of Dr. Yonker, it's interesting to me that so many scientists had not noticed those amazing camel petroglyphs, and yet his mind, prepared by his understanding of the writings of Moses, prepared him to see camel petroglyphs that others had not noticed.
All right, that was a really interesting video, and we're going to unpack that in a minute. But first, I think we wanted to talk about the things that you brought here today, Tim.
Sure. Well, I'm really glad that you enjoyed that film. I had a great time making it, and we can talk about that in just a little while. Mm-hmm. But I brought some archaeological artifacts with me. They're just a couple of little things, and I'll just pick a couple of them, 2 of them up here.
Okay.
When you look at these 2 things, particularly when you look at this oil lamp, both of these, by the way, came from Israel, mm-hmm. and this oil lamp, when you look at it, it looks like a very kind of interesting thing. Mm-hmm. Certainly a lot more interesting than this shard of pottery. This looks uninteresting, whereas the lamp looks interesting. And frequently when archaeology is being done, amateurs like myself, we have a tendency to look at the interesting stuff, or what seems to be interesting to us, and think, oh, that's the important thing. But in fact, the opposite is true with these two things.
Okay.
The lamp is just a fake. It's literally a piece of garbage.
Okay.
And really doesn't tell us anything important about the past. It tells us about, I don't know,
It reminds me of my childhood, and I used to have a lamp, kind of. It wasn't like a lamp, but it was kind of like that shape. And
Okay, anyway.
yeah, anyway.
Yes. Let's not go there.
No.
But the point is, this is not important, and because it doesn't really tell us anything. Whereas this shard here is the important thing, because it came from a fascinating archaeological site called Kiryat Kaiafa. This is a fortified town up above the plain where David and Goliath fought.
Okay.
And it that particular town provides very strong evidence that there was a king in Israel just around that time, when many archaeologists have claimed, oh, no, there wasn't. And the analogy with the work that that's been done by Randy Yonker is this. Think of how many archaeologists went to that particular archaeological site. That's
Mount
how
Sinai.
he knew that it existed in the
Okay.
first place. And he and some others went on an expedition there to see what was there because they'd read about it. And there are all kinds of Egyptian things there. That's what I would have been looking at. But it was the unimportant thing, the thing that people didn't think was important, that simple or relatively simple petroglyph. That was the important thing, because what it did was it informed a particular question about the accuracy of what Moses wrote.
Yeah, the camel feature of that they did not exist during the time of Abraham and Moses and all these biblical patriarchal people was kind of all of a sudden made somewhat irrelevant, because we do have evidence. When the Bible, back in the earlier chapters of its text, speak of camels, like we have a passage here. May
Go
I?
for it, yeah.
Sure. There's a passage here found in the book of Genesis, chapter 37, verse 25, and it says, this is the context, is that Joseph's 11 brothers, or 10 of his brothers, were going to sell him after they threw him in a pit to some Ishmaelite slaves. And it says that when they sat down to eat bread, that is the brothers, and they lifted up their eyes and looked, behold, a company of Ishmaelites came from Gilead, that's from the east, with their camels. There's the camels,
yeah.
bearing spicery and balm and myrrh, going to carry it down to Egypt. And of course, they showed camels in these mining areas, and so there obviously was camel trade going on in Egypt, much as the Bible said there was, when most historical critical or just critical scholars didn't think, oh, that couldn't have happened. It just didn't fit. It doesn't fit our narrative of when things happen. It does fit the Bible narrative quite clearly.
Yeah, one of the things that interests me is there's this constant assumption that people in the past were primitive, and somehow or other, we living today, I don't know, we're so much more sophisticated that we have a better idea of what was going on thousands of years ago than the people who actually lived at that particular time. And of course, then we have this hubris. We say, well, seeing as we believe that they were so primitive back then that they hadn't figured out how to domesticate a camel, seeing as that's the case, therefore this must be nonsense, what was written here. And so we will go with a different theory. We'll go with a theory that the first 5 books of the Bible, in fact, were not written by Moses. They were written by people living only a few hundred years before the time of Christ. And by the way, it wasn't written in, down there in the area of Israel and down into Egypt. It was actually written over in Babylon during the Babylonian captivity. And you can see how this theory sort of starts going in any direction. And yet, when you think about it, a theory like that is simply built on air.
Yeah, they called it the documentary hypothesis, where they even thought that the text itself evolves over the centuries, and none of it could even be trustworthy. And that fortunately has fallen out of vogue for biblical believers, that kind of theory. The document hypotheses were that there were times when different writers would add to the text a little more, and there were the Eloists, there were the priestly writers, there were the Deuteronomist writers, and each one would add a little more to the story, and the story would grow. And they'd use the simple illustration: if we all sat in a semicircle and you whisper in your ear something and they whispered all the way around, what's it going to sound like over there? They assume that's how the Bible was written, in a kind of using that as an analogy. And good science in this case proves that the story was accurate, that no, the text did not evolve, and there's other things that were involved in the undoing of a poor hypothesis that had arisen not too far from the time of Darwin, of all people.
Now, let me run an idea that I've heard many times by you.
Okay.
It's not one that I believe, but there's this idea out there that it really doesn't matter. That you and I, actually the three of us, are having a foolish conversation, because whether or not these myths, let's call them, in the Bible, whether or not they're true is not the point. Because these stories, they teach us some kind of spiritual truth. And it's the spiritual truth that is the important thing. It's not whether or not Abraham or the Ishmaelites or whoever it was had camels back then. So why should I care? Why would I, somebody living in the 21st century, care whether these stories from over 1,000 years before the time of Christ, why would I care whether or not they're actually true?
You would only care unless you decided that you are satisfied with yourself as an authority of what's really true. In the sense that if there isn't an objective truth outside of us, then the only place we have left to go is what's inside of us. And there was a time in the Bible that it describes when people acted kind of that way. They call it the time of Judges, when everyone kind of did what was right in their own mind. And it was actually some of the most horrifying things that happened in the scriptures happened during that time. And when you look at cultures today, the most horrifying times are when every nation and every people think that we can do whatever we want, and it doesn't really matter. So we're trying to find out, well, whose truth, or does God or doesn't he? All these things matter on a much greater level when it comes to attitude and toward each other, why we're important, why these things exist.
But couldn't these, let's call them fairy tales, teach those truths just as well as true stories?
Whose fairy tales do you want to believe? Because some, in some countries it's okay to love your neighbor, and in some cultures it's okay to eat your neighbor. Why not adopt their fairy tales?
Well, yeah, that's.
I'm gonna say,
let's not adopt that particular
fairy tale.
That particular one. Yes.
Now, I want to come back to something that you both said, dissecting a couple words. You said hypothesis, and you said theory. And I know that Dr. Yonker mentions in his film, archaeology, science, it doesn't always prove what we think is true.
Yes. Let me. I actually want to come back to part of your question a little bit later on. But when we talk about a hypothesis, generally we're talking about an idea that can be tested in some way, but that we don't have a huge amount of evidence that is necessarily consistent with it yet.
Okay.
In other words, the hypothesis might serve as a stimulus for going out and taking a look. Well, this is an idea I have. I think this might be the way things are. Right, let's do some experiments to test that. Or if we're looking at historical things, let's go and do some exploring and digging to see what we can find out, see whether it's consistent with that idea.
You could do it as easy as looking at the banners kind of behind it. Says creation and God said, and there's a picture of it looks like the Grand Canyon with the river. The hypothesis could say, boy, that canyon looks like it eroded away that entire river. Well, let's do some sediment testing and see how long that would take, and we'll test the erosion. And others might say, well, no, let's see if is the canyon getting deeper? Is erosion filling in that canyon? That river is rising. There's all kinds of different hypotheses and tests that could occur to prove or to support what you think might be happening there.
Yeah, whereas generally, and again, bear in mind these definitions are a little bit flexible, but generally speaking, a theory is an idea that describes or is consistent with a large body of data.
Okay.
Okay. So we talk about things like the theory of evolution because many people believe that there is a lot of data that are consistent with that particular theory.
Yes.
Now, I'm one of those people who, I think Moses probably had things right when it comes to the creation. And that's one of the reasons why I care about whether he had other things right, whether these are real stories or not. If they're real stories, if we really were created, then there should be a body of evidence that is consistent with that assertion, basically, that Moses makes in here. In fact, the writings of Moses go way beyond just asserting it.
Yeah.
They say, hey, God came down, the Creator, and He told us
He told
that
us
He
so,
created us. In fact, it was so important that He wrote with His own finger in the stone.
Yes.
And
in
fact,
6 days, the Lord
in 6
God,
days.
yes.
We're talking about the fourth commandment here.
Exodus 20, verses 8 through
exactly.
11. In 6 days, the Lord God made the heavens and the earth. Go ahead.
Let's just
tell us
review
what
it.
says.
People were making fun of me earlier for only having a King James version of the Bible here. I'm not one of those people who argues about these things too. I just enjoy the King James. So I hope that everybody else does as well. But it's so beautifully.
You like his literature class on Shakespeare.
Hey, I love Shakespeare.
That's good. That's
Come
Yeah.
on. Yeah. So here's the fourth commandment. And I want you to notice something about it. It starts off with, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days shalt thou labor and do all thy work. So this is talking about something in real life. It's talking about something right now. We're going to celebrate Creation Sabbath. That's not like a theory. No, we have this day that God has set apart for us to remember something, to remember. And then it goes on. But the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord thy God. In it thou shalt not do any work. And I love the list it gives you. There can't be any mistaking of things. It almost reminds me a little bit about being in high school when you sort of think, oh, I'm going to twist those rules around just a little bit here. But God doesn't leave a lot of wiggle room.
No room
He
for
writes,
twisting.
God, not Moses. God writes, thou, nor thy son, nor thy daughter, thy manservant, nor thy maidservant, nor thy cattle, nor thy stranger that is within thy gates. Nobody is to be working on the Sabbath. The whole creation rests on the Sabbath. And Moses, by the way, is demonstrating a principle that he's already laid the philosophical foundation for, right? All humans, all men are equal. Why?
Yes.
We're all descended from one man, Adam.
Yeah.
We're descendants of Adam and Eve, that couple that God Himself created. And so just because somebody is a stranger does not mean that they don't have the same benefit of Sabbath rest as everybody else.
It's interesting that we talk about this as a creation text on this creation Sabbath, but it also hints at a God who's not only huge and powerful, but very intimate and actively involved with the things he made, or more importantly, the people and the creatures he's made. It says to keep it holy, and holiness comes through the presence of the Holy One. That's the way holiness is arrived at, is through the presence of the Holy God himself. So he's entering into the time he has made with the things he's made. He's a powerful creator, but he's a personal creator. He's very close, he's intimate. I love that passage for that reason as well.
You know, I can't help but think to myself, what kind of God is this? Anyway, you know, he's not saying, okay, on every seventh day, I want you to bring me a lot of stuff and sacrifice your children before me or something like that. He's not like the pagan gods. He's saying, let's rest. Let's spend time together.
Yes.
I mean, this is an amazing God.
It's a beautiful thing.
But here's the thing. He's saying, look, let's worship. Worship me on the Sabbath. But he doesn't say, worship me because I will zap you the instant you don't worship me, or worship me by giving me gifts or something like that. He says, worship me, and then he explains why. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven, the earth, the sea, and all that in them is, and rested the seventh day. Wherefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. So again, he brings it straight to reality itself. This is what happened. That's why this should happen with you.
Which goes back to your original thing. Why is it why should we believe it if it's only a fairy tale? But it isn't. It's essential for understanding why we even exist in the first place, who's responsible for it all, and the believability of that book is tied to the works of people like scientists like Randy Yonker, who go out and find these pieces of what seem to be insignificant at first glance, yet they validate the truths that are said historically in that book. It gives you the element to, I can trust in this. This can orient my life. This can do all kinds of good things. And that's what we like to promote here on a Creation Sabbath, is life orientation. God's God, I'm not. That's a good starting place. I can't go puppy and that thing's going to turn into a puppy any day of the week. You know, that's just not how it works.
It's just, yeah. I guess that I get excited about this business of things being so rooted in reality. You know,
Very much.
it's not as if this whole story is told and it's a fairy tale and the creation is a fairy tale. So therefore, I'm going to celebrate a fairy tale Sabbath. You know, I'm going to celebrate a real Sabbath. I'm really going to rest. I'm really going to celebrate the fact that God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the Creator God, who Moses reveals to us thousands of years later. He tells us the truth about the Creator God. I mean, what's not to get excited about?
Yes, and I think, like you said, it's incredible. He's not a God who asks for our things. He can create anything, but he just asks for us, for our hearts, for our commitments to him. And I think that's awesome that he even gives us science to back up what's in the Bible, or that he even allows us to question things. He's not saying you have to believe this. He's giving us evidence to show us why we should believe.
To understand what I believe by faith, no matter where I'm coming from, is essential if I'm going to even come close to probably reality in that sense. You know, I was amazed how many people have never taken a philosophy of science class in all the times I taught. Especially scientists. How many have never had a philosophy of science class? And some of them have, doctorate degrees, and they've, or I had it once. It didn't make an impression on them. Like
didn't seem important at the time.
Didn't seem important at the time. It's too close to that other reality. I couldn't put it in a microscope or see it in a telescope or crunch it onto some computer numbers. You know, we like the empirical stuff. We like the hands-on, but there's some things that are deeper and more meaningful that we strive for. We all want, and that's part of this Creation Sabbath week that we're working towards, to help touch, focus on those greater realities, and be drawn to the great one of the reality, our God Himself, and get that relationship right, that creator-creature initial point. And that's where you find, I found fulfillment, put it that way.
And that's why Moses is so fantastic.
Yeah, he's the author. He got the ball rolling.
He lays that foundation for us. Okay, we're not all scientists, and even if we were all scientists, acting by ourselves, you know, data don't always really speak for themselves. We always interpret data within this framework we call a worldview.
We all wear glasses.
Yes. Here, Moses lays that foundation. He tells us, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. You know, and everything. We live in a created reality. God is a reality, and it gives us that solid starting point where we can go out and start looking at the reality. And by the way, it also allows us to see the beauty that's there, and that's something that we'll have to discuss, I know, in another program, but it's an exciting, beautiful, and wonderful thing about this biblical worldview.
Yes, I think it's truly fascinating, honestly, coming from a perspective of not being a scientist necessarily, but being able to see the correlation between science and faith. It's honestly awesome, and I know that's something that our viewers would love to see as well, you know, seeing that we can find proof, and even if we can't find proof, at least we know that God gives us chances to see that. You know, it's very
the Bible
excellent.
speaks of reasons for our faith.
Yes.
We don't have to think that we are idiots because we don't know. There are things that make life more reasonable. This makes the most sense. And that's why, you know, I'm a biblically based creationist pastor, did studies in these things because that made sense to me. And making sense out of otherwise what I'd consider a world of nonsense was important, I guess, to me. Maybe some people don't care anymore. I was on that I don't care lifestyle at one time in my life. I do care now, and I didn't care before. And and it's related to what Moses wrote down, and that's why we are kind of fans of Moses as far as one of our. He likes Shakespeare, but I think he likes Moses more.
Just a little bit better.
I would agree. Moses is, you know, quite an interesting character. We could talk about his life forever, but I think that's about almost all the time we have for this episode. But I want to thank John and Tim for joining us so much. You know, this was a really interesting topic, and we'll be able to discuss some more interesting topics with our viewers in our next episodes. This is our first episode, and we hope that you'll be joining us for our second episode. And remember, this is a 5-part series. We'll be talking about Creation Sabbath and the celebration of creation and a God who set aside a day for us to spend time with Him and to show Him, you know, how much we love Him and how much He loves us as well. And as you know, we want to say thank you to our viewers for being here. And as our viewers know, we are 100% viewer supported here at LLBN. And it's our viewers who really help us to put on awesome programs like this. And we thank our viewers who are in here who have an interest like me in seeing science and religion. You know, this is something that you study, and this is your life's work. For us, it's an interesting topic to be able to see what your life's work has revealed to you and what is revealing to us. And thank you so much for joining us here on this episode of LLBN's Creation Sabbath. And thank you for joining us, Tim and John.
Thank you.
Thank you.